Welcome everybody to this webinar on the Electronic Release Notification Standard, ERN. My name is Mark Isherwood and I lead the Secretariat for DDEX. I will provide a brief overview of DDEX and then my colleague Niels Rump will walk through some of the detail around how the ERN is constructed, what it's supposed to do, and things of that nature. You are encouraged to ask questions. However, we would ask that you do that through the chat facility on the Join Me app, and when one of us is talking, the other one will be monitoring that, so we will pick things up as we go along. So please feel free to use that facility. So this is the first time we've done a webinar series of this nature. And obviously, we hope that you will find it informative, but we would very much welcome your feedback. And in fact, I will send out a questionnaire probably tomorrow to try and get some feedback and gauge your views on the approach that we're taking. As I've said, if you have any questions during the seminar, please use the chat facility and we will interject what we're doing and try and answer them as we go along. The other thing you should know is that we are recording this webinar and we will publish this on our website if you at any time want to go back and revisit what was said. The creation of our standards and the ability to create efficient communication relies on three things interacting together. The first one is the actual format of the standard messages, which many of you probably already use. And that obviously sets out the order in which the data that you're passing to your business partners should be laid out for communication. The other element is what we call choreographies, which is effectively a series of triggers that says if company A sends message X to company B, then company B is expected to send something in return. Obviously, that's a very simple example, but sometimes these things can get much more complex. And then the third piece is the mechanism by which the messages actually get exchanged. Most of the exchange for DDEX messages up until the last 2-3 years has been using SFTP technology, and we created standard ways in which that should be used. Increasingly, the industry is moving towards web services, and obviously that introduces a different kind of complexity with regard to the nature of the protocols that need to be used. So DDEX's mission is, as I've kind of indicated already, to develop standard message formats, develop choreographies around specific business transactions, and to standardize the communication protocols. As part of that, however, we're invariably looking at how identification of entities that appear in the messages, be they a musical work, a sound recording, an artist, a composer. And we do a lot of work with other standards organizations, particularly ISPI and CSAC, which administer ISRC and ISWC respectively, although they do other work in this space, which we also work with them on. And DDEX also has a brief where necessary to introduce its own identification systems, and we have done that on 1 or 2 occasions. There is also a very broad attempt to improve metadata quality and consistency. If any of you have worked in the industry for any length of time, you will know that that is an issue. And although DDEX on its own can't wave a magic wand and change things, clearly we do work within the organization to try and encourage best practice in this area, and that filters out throughout the industry. In terms of its corporate structure, DDEX is a not-for-profit membership organization. We have 120 plus members now from across the entire value chain, be they owners, administrators of musical works, owners, administrators of sound recordings, digital music retailers, which we refer to as DSPs, and technology companies, and more recently companies that are from the studio environment, particularly software developer companies operating in that particular sphere. We obviously, as a membership organizations, we have three layers of members. The full members, which in terms of number make up the bulk of the membership. As members, they're able to attend all of the principal meetings that we have, the working group meetings, those are the technical working groups, our plenary meetings, which are physical meetings, which take place usually twice a year, and an annual meeting, rather like an AGM. They're able to provide working group chairs or nominate people to be agreed as working group chairs. They see what we call a committee draft in order to comment on it, and the committee draft is effectively the sort of penultimate step before DDEX publishes to the wider world any of its standards. And the standards process we have triggers, when we trigger a committee draft, triggers several actions that have to be done in a certain period in order to get the standards published out to the wider world. And full member fees are based on their revenue. The other two categories of members are charter members, who basically get the same benefits as full members. The addition they get, though, is the ability to nominate a board member, and for that they pay $27,035 per annum. The number of charter members is limited to 21. And the third group is the associate members. These don't participate in the work exactly, but they do have access to documents, and as with all DDEX members, are able to comment on committee drafts when we publish them. They can attend the annual meeting and can attend plenary meetings under certain conditions, and they pay a flat annual fee of $2,675 per annum. You can see the current membership list on DDEX.net under the membership tab. But in terms of the charter members, the musical work rights owners and administrators are principally represented by Right Society, ASCAP BMI from the US, Gamer from Germany, PRS from the UK, SACEM from France, and SOCAM from Canada, and Cobalt Music Publishing. On the owners and administrators of sound recordings, as you would expect, the three major labels are there, but also three societies, collective management organizations that collect on behalf of record companies and producers, PPL in the UK, SCPP in France, and Sound Exchange in the US. And the last group is the DSPs and technology service providers, all household names pretty much: Amazon, Google, Spotify, Apple, Pandora, and Tencent Music from Canada. At the moment, we have 2 vacancies amongst the charter members. The other sort of relationships that DDEX have are our licensees. When you review standards documentation, there is an evaluation license associated with it, which allows you to review the documentation. But if you want to actually implement, you need to take out an implementation license to actually use the standards. And one of the key parts of that is that we do encourage people to provide feedback on the standards, so that we're doing everything we can to get the standards to meet as wide a possible set of requirements as possible. We also have a category of companies called liaison organizations. These are trade associations and standards bodies, and they're basically a relationship to allow DDEX to communicate about what it's doing to a wider audience than just its membership. And so the trade associations who have members of their own and standards bodies communicate on our behalf to their own members, and obviously that helps public awareness of what we're doing. We currently have 11 organizations of that nature from across the industry, and that is an area of association with DDEX that is growing all the time. Clearly, if you would like to become a member of DDEX, we would very much encourage that so that you can become part of the process of developing the standards. And there's an application form on the website, ddex.net. As I've kind of mentioned already, the way we operate is that we have various technical working groups. These set requirements for any standards or for any changes to the standards. They then review proposed solutions that are provided to them by the Secretariat, and they meet by telephone conference, sharing documents online through web facilities like the one we're using here. We also have these two physical meetings, plenary meetings per year, which rotate between the east coast of North America, west coast of North America, and Europe. And the purpose of those is to review everything that the working groups are doing, make recommendations to the board about new work items, and generally try and push the agenda forward as far as the technical work that DDEX is doing. We also occasionally will have specific topic physical meetings, or where a working group has a particularly long agenda of activity that it needs to get through, we will actually have physical meetings in order to try and push through the work in order to make sure we're as up to date as we can be. The key part about the way in which we operate is that DDEX makes decisions by consensus, which broadly means agreement, but is a lack of sustained opposition to a particular approach in solving a particular technical issue. The effect of that is it's a very positive and engaging environment in which DDEX works. So we now have 8 areas of activity: release delivery, which is what we're talking about today, media enrichment, which is what we kind of refer to as non-core data about sound recordings, artists and composers. And there is a webinar about that later in this month. Sales and usage reporting, which is obviously kind of what it says, is where DSPs notify rights owners of what's been used of their repertoire. A claim detail message, which is a standard that's only just been published, is used primarily in the musical work owners administration sector, where when they receive a sales and usage report, they have to make claims to the DSPs about the works that they control in order that they can make a claim and receive royalties. In terms of the presentation, as I mentioned earlier on, we will be publishing this with a recording on the website, and we will notify you of that in due course. Work notification and licensing is similar to claim and detail message, but is very much focused on the mechanical rights licensing process in the US, which is very much more fragmented than it is in most other territories, and the messages we're creating there are designed to support that process. Music licensing companies are the sound exchange PPLs of this world, not to be mixed up with Mechanical Licensing Collective, which is also MLC. And they are, that's for communication amongst themselves, because obviously there's usually at least one of these organizations in each territory, but also for communication with record companies and performer representatives. We also have a standard that people can use to exchange data about links between musical works and sound recordings. And lastly, the collection of studio metadata is a standard that we're trying to get adopted as much as possible in the studio environment to encourage the collection of data at source. The bottom line is really representing our attempts, which to be honest have been a little limited, to encourage conformance in the sense that all of the standards get implemented the same way by all companies. We know that's not the case, and this is something that we continue to look at. And these can be represented to show which players within the industry are likely to be exchanging these messages by virtue of this map, which, for anybody that knows, looks a little like the tube map for London. And you can see there that that's how it all fits together. What we're focusing on here today is release delivery, which is principally between record companies, distributors to DSPs, but that also includes the communication of the actual sound recordings themselves, which begins obviously right back in the studio. But the main focus, as far as that's concerned today, is between record companies, distributors, and on to DSPs. So pretty much the last thing that I will say is that the thing that underpins our standards more than anything else is the data dictionary, DDEX data dictionary. It contains all the semantics for all of the terms that appear in all of the messages, and it shows the common structures that we use for certain types of composites, particularly things that appear in more or less every message, like parties. How do you describe a party? How do you describe a sound recording or a musical work? And the structure of those is within the data dictionary. And so it is very much the foundation of what we do. And DDEX is sometimes described as a language, a common language that everybody can speak, so that they can actually communicate with each other, even though they themselves may be using quite different data models to store and process their data. In terms of implementation, DDEX has very limited information about who is actually doing implementation, but over 5,500 companies have taken out implementation licenses, so that gives some indication. But what we do know is that there isn't really a company in the music industry that's serious about what they do that isn't using DDEX to some degree or other. So that's a brief introduction to DDEX as a whole. I will now hand over to Niels, who will talk much more specifically about ERN and the release delivery standard.
Thank you very much, Mark. But again, as Mark said at the very beginning, if you have any questions, please do ask through the chat function, and we will hopefully be able to answer those questions. So, Electronic Release Notification Message Suite Standard, quite a handful or mouthful, ERN for short. As Mark said, it's all about distributing content from an online, from a record company or its distributor to an DSP that can then further distribute the content on to consumers. And the process is really, really simple in this case, luckily. There it is. So a record company that has new content that the record company wishes a DSP to distribute, they need to communicate several aspects to the DSP. The first is, what is the content itself? What are the sound recordings on it? What are the images on it, the cover images and the like? Who are the artists? Who are the contributing artists? What's the big name in the front? All of that information needs to be communicated. In addition, the DSP needs to know when, where, and under which conditions the content may be made available to consumers. Is it a stream? Is it a download? Is it from the 1st of January onwards, or is it the 1st of February? Is it in the US? Is it in Canada? Is it in the UK? All of those aspects need to be communicated, and that is what the new release message of the ERN standard does. It also allows the record company to tell a DSP to stop distributing content, be it because of a legal dispute or just because they don't want a specific sound recording or release to be streamed, for example, anymore. The same message, though typically without deals and takedowns, can also be sent to metadata companies to furnish them with all the metadata that they may want to use to do their business and to then further enrich the metadata and to work with it. ERN messages are what we call statements of truth. They're stateless. And that means that whenever you, as a sender of an ERN message, want to update something, you need to send the entire message again. Through that, the recipient does not need to look at what has changed between those messages. They simply can take the new message and run with it from that moment onwards. So there is no ability to update individual fields. It's a one message replaces an older message in one go. And while this adds traffic to the communication, yes, there is more data that needs to be communicated. The ingestion process is much simpler, and the need for remembering an earlier state can quite often lead to inconsistencies. Therefore, we opted to not do that. And the same approach applies to the communication of binaries. If you want to update one of the resource files, the MP3 files, or whatever the codec may be, that are attached to an ERN message, if you want to replace one, you have to replace them all. Again, it adds bits that need to flow through the pipe, but it makes the logic of creation and ingestion much easier. And that's, in the end, what costs money. Therefore, that's what we've kept as simple as possible. So how does an ERN message look like? Well, it's structurally actually quite simple. It's an XML structure. And it starts by let's talk about a release, an album. If you want to make available either for streaming or for download, you need to communicate the album that contains the content. And you would describe the release by the usual metadata elements. You would need to give it an identifier, typically a UPC barcode. You would need to give it a title. It needs to have the artist names and certain marketing information like parental warning and all of those kind of information. Linked to that release, or in that release, are a number of sound recordings. And I'm just showing two here because otherwise I'd run out of space on the slide. And again, you would need to describe a sound recording in very much the same way as you would need to describe a release. It needs an identifier. For a sound recording, it would typically be an ISRC. You need to have a title, you need to have artists, you will need to have contributors, so who actually played the guitar on a specific sound recording, and the like. For each of those sound recordings, you then need to create what is called a track release. And a track release is basically what a streaming service provider would actually, quote, sell, unquote. Each of the sound recordings, they're just the sound recordings. By making it a track release, it becomes a tradable asset. And again, you would have an UPC and all the usual information that you would need to communicate for a release, as I've described earlier. And then you can say, hey, when does the album when may the album be made available, and when may the track releases be made available? And it may very well be that, for example, a streaming service provider does not have a deal linked to the album, because they will never make the album available. They will only make the track releases available. After all, streaming an album is a nonsensical thing. You would stream the tracks one after the other. And then, as I said, the deal describes things like price points, allowed types of usage, territory, the time period in which that can be used, and all of those details. And last but not least, you have musical work information related to the sound recording. So who were the writers, the composers, what's the title of the work, and again, an identifier for the musical work, an ISWC. On this slide, the musical work information is inverted, colorful font on white background, because actually nobody really used it. There can still be musical work information be communicated, but it would, in the ERN message, virtually always done as part of the sound recording metadata itself. Now, this structure that I've just outlined was designed in the basically in the early noughties, so it's not that young anymore. The first widely used version was ERN 3, and ERN 3.7 and 3.8 are, I think, still the most used versions of the ERN standard today. Now, during the development of ERN 3 over the years, we added information for a variety of different distribution models that record companies and DSPs were working on. Some of them never really made it into the standard. And in any case, there were some things, some design choices that we made in the early noughties that we wouldn't certainly do today anymore, make today anymore. So we overhauled ERN 4 and we created this new standard, and it's about 4 years old now. Most of the concepts remain the same, but some things are different. So if we're looking at ERN 3, this is how ERN 3 looks, same slide as before. This is how ERN 4 looks. First of all, we got away with the musical work information. As I said, nobody used it anyway. The sound recording metadata has been extended to provide all the work metadata that needs to be communicated. And we also now have the track releases much simplified and streamlined. Before, each track release needed, for example, to have a title. But they inherit the title from the sound recording. It is exactly the same, always. So why is there any duplication of data necessary? There isn't. So all of that information has been taken away. And last, but certainly not least, we introduced a party composite, as we call it, to the message. We can now better separate out different contributors and artists to the messages, to the sound recording in the message. In ERN 3, quite often, composers and recording artists and display artists were only referenced through their name. And if the name happens to be Von Williams, then you may actually find there are different of those people, but the DSP didn't know. Were they the same person, or were they just different people who happened to have the same name? This is virtually impossible now with the ERN 4 structure, where you would have a separate composite for each of the people, for each of the writers, for each of the publishers, for each of the record companies, for each of the people and companies involved in creating a release. And they all would have an identifier and a name, and you could separate them out quite nicely. So that is a major benefit as well of ERN4. One of the things that have made ERN3 really complex is the need to have territorial variations of metadata. The image there is of an English band called Suede, or as it's known in the US as the London Suede. I assume there's another band, the Suede, in the US. But that information needs to be communicated. So if an album from the Suede is being communicated, you need to have in the metadata for the UK, they need to be listed as Suede, and in the metadata communicated for the US, it needs to be the English Suede, or the London Suede rather. ERN3 made this rather inelegantly with having a huge composite where all the data that can be territorially different is collapsed. Which means that if you have, for example, a band where the name differs between the UK and the US, you would need to communicate all the other information, the title and all of the other things, as well twice. And that's not good. In ERN4, it's much more efficient. You just say for each individual data element to which territory it applies, and you would simply provide 2 band names and be done with it.
Niels, there's some questions come in. Could you repeat the comment about the point at which a sound recording becomes a tradable asset?
I can certainly try, yes. So a sound recording itself is just the thing that has been recorded onto a recording media in the studio, has been mixed and is now ready to be listened to. But sound recordings themselves are not the thing that is being quote sold to consumers. The model that DDEX has developed is that the only thing that is being traded to consumers are releases. Releases contain sound recordings and other assets such as images, videos, and so forth. And because we have this model, it then follows that in order to have a deal, you need to have a release. One can say, for example, that the combination of a deal with a release, that's a product that you buy. That's what in the physical world, you have the physical instantiation of a CD standing in the shop, together with the price tag. That's a product that you can take away, and it's to some extent similar here, just that it's files on a server. But the release as the collection of sound recordings is what is basically being traded or being traded, yes. Does that help?
Okay, well, we may find out. Isn't there a link needed between party and album release on the slide?
Yes, there is. Absolutely. There is, but I didn't draw it on this diagram. You're absolutely right. All the releases, and it's for the individual contributors, who plays the guitar, who sings, who's the engineer, all of that, as well as the big name that you would write in front of on the jewel case as the display artist. Both would be parties.
And is the party ID used in the party composite a standard like ISNI, or each record company's internal reference or bilateral agreement?
Yes, both. Ideally,
well, all three, really.
Yes, no, you're right. No, DDEX is trying to move everybody towards using standardized identifiers. So ISNI is certainly one way in which a party can be identified. And I personally would certainly encourage people to do that. However, there are existing identifiers in specific market segments, such as the IPI name number for composers and writers and the IPN for performers, that actually work quite well in their segments, and they can also be communicated. But all of the things, the track releases, the album releases, sound recordings, they all can also carry proprietary identifiers. And for us, a proprietary identifier always comprises of two parts: who assigned the identifier and the identifier itself. So that even if that identifier gets passed on later on, you would still know, oh, that was an identifier that was originally allocated by, say, Sony Music, for example.
Okay. If Niels hasn't answered those questions, obviously come back on the chat. I'll hand back to Niels.
One of the other things that is quite challenging for DDEX is the vast variety of different ways in which music can be made available to consumers. The music industry is a creative industry, and that is not only in the studio, but certainly also in the way in which music is made available. Luckily, each of the individual ways is actually quite similar when you want to describe it in terms of metadata, and it is quite simple, actually. Still, the ERN message needs to be able to communicate all of those. And the way in which we then try to square this circle is by what we call profiles. And if you could imagine the entire plethora of different ways in which music can be made available as this kind of jigsaw puzzle, wouldn't it be lovely if, for you, if you want to implement one of those bits, you only need to read one or two of those standards or jigsaw pieces, read 10 pages instead of 1,000, have a much smaller code base? Well, that's precisely what we're doing. We're describing how to describe a classical album or a ringtone release or a multi-disc pop album in what we call release profiles, by saying how do you need to describe the titles, how do you need to provide artist names and identifiers, as we've just discussed, what is the release structure and all of those things. And also, how to deal with takedowns, redeliveries, all of those things we describe in these profiles. And Mark earlier talked about conformance. One of the things that actually has driven the level of conformity significantly up is the introduction of profiles, because now people have much more instructions how to use the ERN message for a specific purpose than they used to have beforehand. Is there still wiggle room in there? Yes. Does it have to be? Also yes, because we can't describe every small detail in the standard. We would not get anywhere if we tried, but it is much better these days than it used to be. Let me quickly talk about takedowns.
Sorry, Niels, just
yes,
before you do that, I just want to clarify a point. The viewer 124 has made a point about party ID relating to a comment from viewer 113. I think the party ID that viewer 113 was talking about was not the DDEX party ID, which is something different. You are correct. The DDEX party ID is simply to identify the sender and receiver of a message. What we were talking about in the context that viewer 113 asked their question was the identification of other parties like artists and composers. I hope that just clarifies that point.
So, takedowns. So usually what happens is a record company says, oh, this content needs to be taken down. A DSP must stop distributing the content, quite often because there is some kind of a legal dispute going on. Usually, remember, we have this statement of truth operation. You just send a normal ERN message with all the metadata. You don't need to send the resource files but with all the metadata, just without a deal. This means, hey, there is no further deal available anymore to the DSP, therefore the content needs to be taken down. You can also do that before the takedown happens. In that case, you simply have all the deals with a specific end date. And at the end of that period of time, all the deals will fall away. The content should disappear. So it requires the label to send full release details. However, this not always works, because sometimes a record company just doesn't have the metadata in its system, especially when they take over the catalog from another record company. And even worse, if that content is a little bit older, quite often the metadata actually has changed. And since the normal takedown would then require the record company to add the content into its system just to take it down, we created this purge release message, which is kind of a nuclear option to remove content. And then you would normally follow that up with a new release message, which then would put up the content again. Very, very quickly, the message exchange protocol. Mark's already talked about FTP or SFTP, Safe FTP. It's quite ubiquitous and quite simple, and people use it for ERN and have used it since ERN started to be used in about 2008, I would think. And we have three different ways in which that can be effected. There is the release-by-release method, where you take an ERN and all the resource files, you put it up on a specific agreed address. The file naming convention is defined by DDEX. The structure of the FTP server is defined by DDEX. Access to the FTP server is bilaterally agreed between sender and receiver. So you put one release there, and as soon as the release is there, the recipient knows, oh, I can now download this and process this. There is the batched approach, where once a day, once a month, once an hour, the recipient or the sender opens a new batch, puts his new stuff in there. Whenever that period of time has come to an end, they basically put a manifest file into the same folder, which then signals to the recipient that the content is ready. They can ingest the content and move on. And we even deal with hard disk deliveries, which sounds odd for the year 2020. But if a larger label wants to communicate their entire catalog to a new DSP, at that stage, the sneaker net is still the fastest way to distribute that, to communicate that. And therefore, the hard disk delivery is basically a huge batch which we can provide using, well, hard disks. So we define the server structure, the file naming convention, and people have been using this for quite a while. It has one major drawback, though. The record company doesn't really know whether the content has successfully arrived. Yes, there is an acknowledgement process, part of the SFTP protocol that we use. But that's quite low level and more functional than or more. I have received it, but whether they could do anything with it doesn't add into the equation at this stage. So about 8 years ago or something like that, 7 years ago, we defined a web service approach, which is an asymmetric approach where a record company would publish their content on their web service infrastructure, and a DSP can then pull down the content they want. This architecture is not only used between DSPs, between record companies and DSPs, but it's actually also used within some record companies for their internal systems. So a label would publish new content on their web service. It gets pushed to the DSPs via an Atom feed, which is basically a table of contents of what is new at that label for a specific DSP. The DSP can then look at this and pull down the content it wishes to receive. And again, this is done using web services. So the DSP then pulls down from the web service the ERN message, which then contains, again, web service addresses for the individual resources. And the DSP can then pull those resources down. When we developed this, the record companies were rather worried that the DSPs control the engagement. And that's something people were very uncomfortable with. But in fact, it's not a problem. As long as there's a service level agreement in place where the record company, where the DSP has agreed to call the web service of a label once a day, once a week, once an hour, again, bilaterally agreeable. At that stage, it's then up to the label to deliver takedown notices, especially to the DSPs whenever they do call the web service. So this approach is more and more implemented by people, and over time I would expect the FTP to be phased out and the web service to be phased in. One other thing that is worth mentioning at this stage is that I've always talked about record company and DSP, but of course a lot of the communication happens through intermediaries. And these two approaches can also be used between a record company and some kind of an aggregator distributor company who then forwards basically the content to DSPs. Whether that is using FTP or web services, both would be valid. So the whole standard and the whole process has been developed with those intermediaries in mind. So how does ERN 4.2 look like? Now, this is something very few, I don't know whether there are any members taking part in this seminar, but those of you who are not members, they will not have seen this structure of the message. This is ERN 4.2. Mark has mentioned at the very beginning the concept of a committee draft, which is when the working group that's working on a standard thinks they're done, and we then send it to all of our members for a review. Well, the ERN working group thinks that ERN 4.2 is done. They have published this committee draft to all of our members, and we're now waiting their verdict. So we should have, fingers crossed, we should have ERN 4.2 published within the next certainly 2 months. So this is the structure of the ERN message. In blue, you have the major composite. You have a message header, which contains the usual information: who sends what to whom, when was the message created. Quite important, is it a test message or is it actually a message that contains real data that should be used for production systems? There is, I'll ignore the release admin for a moment. There's this party list that describes parties. There is a cue sheet list which allows us, especially for videos, to say, here's a video and this contains the following cues within the video. Quite handy for videos, as I said. The resource list contains all the metadata for the sound recordings, videos, images. What other resources do we have? Text resources for lyrics, for example, that can be communicated through that. Chaptering is important, especially for audio books and again for videos, where you can basically chop an individual sound recording or video in subparts and say from 0 to minute 5 is this chapter, from minute 5 to minute 10 is that chapter, and so forth. Then we have the releases, and then we have deals, and then there is this supplemental document list, which allows the DSP to receive any kind of additional information that the sender may want to send. amongst which is information about this formed in this this MEAD standard, the media enrichment and description format, which we have released 4 months ago, nearly half a year ago now. So that's the overall structure. I can go into much more deep details if we want to do that. We can do that via the questions if we want to. So what's really new in ERN 4.2? The first is session information is for the first time supported in ERN. So the individual recording sessions can be dated and the location be given. We support classified genres, as I would call that. ERN has so far just had a free-form text field for genres. The MEAD standard introduced a genre list, a code list with genres, and this has been incorporated into ERN now. We much better support different dialects. We could say that a title is in a specific language in ERN 4.1, but in 4.2 we can say that this is now in Swiss German rather than High German, or in British English but not American English, and those kind of things. There is a much better handling of encodings, different encodings communicating MP3s next to AACs, next to Atmos files, and how a DSP can receive, or a label can send. For example, they sent MP3 and AACs, and now they want to upgrade the listening experience to Atmos for all the resources. How that can be done, well, that has been is much more sophisticated in 4.2. Because of this relationship between then an MP3 sound recording and an Atmos encoded sound recording, we needed better support for relationships between different sound recordings as well as different releases. And last but not least, this release admin information that we talked about, or that I ignored earlier, that allows a record company to nominate a group of people who can get access to an administrative console at the DSP, which then gives the label market share kind of information and how a specific releases are doing on that platform, which then helps the label to drive marketing campaigns and those kind of things. That's something that has happened increasingly over the last couple of years, and now we're actually supporting this in the standard rather than requiring extra standard communication to happen. I see there are two questions. Let me just do the last slide, and then we can do the questions. I just wanted to bring the whole thing back to MEAD, which is this standard to allow rich metadata to be delivered to DSPs from record companies, but also from dedicated metadata companies. And the first place where we see MEAD, or will see MEAD, because people are implementing it as we speak, would be as part of an ERN feed. And this is where this associate document link at the end of the ERN message comes handy, where you can basically say, oh, here, by the way, are MEAD documents that talk about the artists and the album and the sound recordings that are in that ERN message. And here's all the rich information that the MEAD standard provides. Questions, Mark?
Well, and by the way, if you want to learn more about MEAD and haven't already signed up, there is a webinar on that on the 26th of March. So go to the DDEX website, events, and you can go from there. So, Niels, two questions. What is a cue sheet list?
Well, a cue sheet is basically, well, why don't we become dirty and look at some cue sheets? So, a cue sheet, I hope people can see this. Cue sheet list is a list of cue sheets. Not very inventive there. And they contain individual cues. And that's quite a lot of information. But a cue basically now can let you know that within a video, for example, a specific sound recording is used at a specific point, or a specific musical work is used in a specific from a specific point in time in that video. So you will have somewhere a time code in here, start time and duration. So from when and how long is that musical work used in a specific sound recording? It's very often used, especially for video broadcasting, where music rights societies need to know which musical work is used. For example, in a TV drama, the intro and the outro at the end, and then you have the dramatic music when the victim gets finally stabbed to death. Well, somebody has written that. That needs to be communicated so that any revenue, any royalties can be paid, and that information is communicated in a cue sheet.
And the second one is, would you say the biggest change between 4.1 and 4.2 is the product visibility, and not applicable in 4.1?
The biggest change is the between 4.1 and 4.2. Is that the question, or between 3 and 4?
It's between 4.1 and 4.2.
That's an interesting question. It really, there isn't that much, looking at it, there isn't that much in it. It's more a cumulative effect. I think the session information is quite important. No, I think the biggest is the support for handling different encodings in one recording. The problem that we had was this. I need to go into the message and show you what I mean. So in the resource list, in the sound recording, we have somewhere the technical resource details. So for each sound recording, there needs to be I use MP3 as the example, needs to be an MP3 file accompanying the ERN message. And you have, it says here that the audio codec type and so forth. Generally speaking, there is the agreement that whenever the technical details are there, then the sound recording file, the MP3 file, will also be communicated. If I don't want to communicate at the resource files, I exclude the technical details composite. If I include it, then I need to also include the MP3 files. But if I now have different encodings, and I want to add an encoding especially, I suddenly need to include technical details. But then there's a second rule that kicks in. If you provide one MP3 file, you need to provide all the MP3 files. So suddenly, you had a release with 10 tracks in 3 encodings. That's 30 MP3 files already delivered. And now a 4th encoding comes to it, and I now need to redeliver all the 30 previously delivered MP3 files, and now I need to deliver the 10 more files to it. That was untenable, especially when we're now talking about Atmos and those kind of encodings, because those files are getting quite substantial. And we now have a flag here. I assume it's in here. No. Which says whether it is actually is provided in delivery. There is the flag which says, actually, I'm not in delivery. I'm just a new encoding. I'm an old encoding. I'm not provided in the delivery. I think that's the biggest change between those two versions. I hope that made sense and I was not ranting too much.
Okay, so we're sort of on time for finishing. Are there any other questions that anybody has that they want to raise on the chat?
And if not, you can always ask afterwards via the website.
And okay, in that case, as I said, just to remind you, we are recording this webinar, and we will put that up on the website in the next couple of days. I will be contacting you to show you where that's going to be, and also, again, really ask you, if you would, to complete the questionnaire that will be part of that email, because it's important that we learn from what we're doing well and what we're doing badly on these webinars for everybody else. So thank you very much for attending. I would remind you again, obviously, if having dipped your toe into DDEX for the first time, you want to become a member, that is also possible by going to the membership tab on the DDEX.net website. So thank you all for your time, and hopefully you will join us on one of these again in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.